1 chapter a day challenge. 15th day. Acts of the Apostles. Chapter 27.
The departure for Rome. When it had been decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion called Julius, of the Augustan cohort. We boarded a vessel from Adramyttium bound for ports on the Asiatic coast, and put to sea. We had Aristarchus with us, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. Next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius was considerate enough to allow Paul to go to his friends to be looked after. From there we put to sea again, but as the winds were against us we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. Then across the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, taking a fortnight to reach Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship leaving for Italy and put us aboard. For some days we made little headway, and we had difficulty in making Cnidus. The wind would not allow us to touch there, so we sailed under the lee of Crete off Cape Samone, and struggled along the coast until we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Storm and shipwreck. A great deal of time had been lost, and navigation was already hazardous, since it was now well after the time of the fast, so Paul gave them this warning. Friends, I can see this voyage will be dangerous, and that we run the risk of losing not only the cargo and the ship but also our lives as well. But the centurion took more notice of the captain and the ship's owner than of what Paul was saying. And since the harbour was unsuitable for wintering, the majority were for putting out from there in the hope of wintering at Phoenix, a harbour in Crete, facing southwest and northwest. A southerly breeze sprang up and, thinking their objective as good as reached, they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close inshore. But it was not long before a hurricane, the northeaster as they call it, burst on them from across the island. The ship was caught and could not be turned head-on to the wind, so we had to give way to it and let ourselves be driven. We ran under the lee of a small island called Cauda and managed with some difficulty to bring the ship's boat under control. They hoisted it aboard, and with the help of tackle-bound cables round the ship, then, afraid of running aground on the Syrtis banks, they floated out the sea anchor and so let themselves drift. As we were making very heavy weather of it, the next day they began to jettison the cargo. And the third day they threw the ship's gear overboard with their own hands. For a number of days both the sun and the stars were invisible, and the storm raged unabated until at last we gave up all hope of surviving. Then, when they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among the men. Friends, he said, if you had listened to me and not put out from Crete, you would have spared yourselves all this damage and loss. But now I ask you not to give way to despair. There will be no loss of life at all, only of the ship. Last night there was standing beside me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You are destined to appear before Caesar, and for this reason God grants you the safety of all who are sailing with you. So take courage, friends, I trust in God that things will turn out just as I was told. But we are to be stranded on some island. On the 14th night we were being driven one way and another in the Adriatic, *B, when about midnight the crew sensed that land of some sort was near. They took soundings and found 20 fathoms. After a short interval they sounded again and found 15 fathoms. Then, afraid that we might run aground somewhere on a reef, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When some of the crew tried to escape from the ship and lowered the ship's boat into the sea as though to lay out anchors from the bows, Paul said to the centurion and his men, unless those men stay on board you cannot hope to be saved. So the soldiers cut the boat's ropes and let it drop away. Just before daybreak Paul urged them all to have something to eat. For 14 days he said, you have been in suspense, going hungry and eating nothing. Let me persuade you to have something to eat, your safety is not in doubt. Not a hair of your heads will be lost. With these words he took some bread, gave thanks to God in front of them all, broke it and began to eat. Then they all plucked up courage and took something to eat themselves. We were in all 276 souls on board that ship. When they had eaten what they wanted they lightened the ship by throwing the corn overboard into the sea. When day came they did not recognize the land, but they could make out a kind of bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship aground on this if they could. They slipped the anchors and left them to the sea, and at the same time loosened the lashings of the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they headed for the beach. But the cross-currents carried them into a shoal and the vessel ran aground. The bows were wedged in and stuck fast, while the stern began to break up with the pounding of the waves. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners for fear that any should swim off and escape. But the centurion was determined to bring Paul safely through, and would not let them do what they intended. He gave orders that those who could swim should jump overboard first and so get ashore, and the rest follow either on planks or on pieces of wreckage. In this way all came safe and sound to land.
Thank you. Subscribe. Every day, a new chapter.